We've been looking at the Exodus story, Moses' story, throughout the month of October. Today's reading is the well-known story about God parting the Red Sea. It's a story that comes after another well-known story, God demonstrating power over Pharaoh and all creation and any other god through what are often referred to as the 10 plagues. God exercised that power in an effort to deliver the Hebrews from enslavement. And in that story, first water is turned to blood to convince Pharaoh to let God's people go. And when that doesn't change Pharaoh's heart, there are 8 more miracles: plagues of frog, lice, flies, livestock disease, boils, violent hailstorms, locusts, and days of darkness. And none of those threatening plagues caused Pharaoh to let God's people go. And so there's a final 10th and terrible act, similar to Pharaoh's killing of the Hebrew infants. The firstborn of Egyptians die while death passes over the Hebrews' households. And finally, Pharaoh lets the Hebrew slaves go. And our lesson today picks up with Pharaoh changing his mind and sending his mighty army after the freed slaves. And the army catches up with the Hebrews at the edge of the Red Sea. And stuck between the pursuing army and a body of water, all seemed lost until God caused the sea to part through Moses, who then led the people to safety on the other side. And Pharaoh's army follows in hot pursuit. God causes the sea to crash down on top of them, and the pursuit is finally ended. Rabbi Lawrence Kusher, one of my famous authors, one of my favorite authors, and a famous Jewish spiritual rabbi, spins an interesting yarn and poses some compelling thoughts about the miracle of the Red Sea. Here's an excerpt from his story. When the people of Israel crossed through the Red Sea, they witnessed a great miracle. Some say it was the greatest miracle that ever happened. On that day they saw a sight more awesome than all the visions of the prophets combined. The sea split and the water stood like great walls, while Israel escaped to freedom on the distant shore. Awesome, but not for everyone. 2 people, Reuben and Shimon, hurried along among the crowd, crossing through the sea, and they never once looked up. They noticed only the ground underneath their feet was still a little muddy like a beach at low tide. Yuck, said Reuben, there's mud all over the place. Black, said Shimon, I have muck all over my feet. This is terrible, answered Reuben. When we were slaves in Egypt, we had to make bricks out of mud just like this. Yeah, said Shimon, there's no difference between being a slave in Egypt and being free here. And so it went, Reuben and Shimon whining and complaining all the way to freedom. For them, there was no miracle, only mud. Their eyes were closed. They might as well have been asleep. And then Rabbi Kushner notes, we need to wake up and keep our eyes open to the many beautiful, mysterious, and holy things that happen around us every day. Many of them are like little miracles. When we wake up and see the morning light, when we taste food and grow strong, when we learn from others and grow wise, when we hug the people we love and feel warm, when we help those around us and feel good. All these and more are there for us every day, but we must open our eyes to see them. Otherwise, we will be like Reuben and Shimon, able to see only mud. Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. In Kushner's story, Reuben and Shimon whine and complain all the way to freedom, not seeing, not appreciating the glorious acts of God. And if you've read the whole Exodus story, you know that God's people do a lot of whining and complaining. And many preachers and scholars over the ages have focused on the whining and complaining and the backsliding and the sin that God's people do. But to focus on the mud and the filth in the story is to miss the main point. At its heart, Exodus is a confessional story about God's rescue of the people of Israel from their oppression as slaves in Egypt, and God's deliverance of Israel to a safe place, and then later to the promised land. This is a good news story. It's not a bad news story. And the good news of the Exodus tradition is a fundamental part of God's dialogue with early Israel. It's spoken for ages of God's care for the oppressed and promised to save even them and deliver them to a much better place. Ultimately, Exodus is not a story about backsliding and sin. It's about salvation. Like I said, it's a good news story. Early Israel continually looked to the good news Exodus story and updated it, reinterpreted it to find current theological meaning, but always remembering and reflecting upon the characteristic Exodus-wise manner in which God is experienced in the story. The Exodus tradition became the paradigm, the prototype, if you will, for all of Israel's confessional stories. And consequently, Exodus, salvation is a dominant theme throughout the Bible. In the Old and New Testament, God saves all manner of people, always delivering them to a better place. The Exodus story is at its root a lesson in theology, how to understand God. The story was never meant primarily as a witness to past events, but rather as a witness to how God was and is and can be experienced. And don't get me wrong, Exodus probably has roots in some kind of actual event. But any such event has long been lost in the reshaping of the story while it passed through generations in both oral and written forms. And there are theories about how and why the Exodus story arose and became important to early Israel. Such theories are based on analysis of the biblical text in conjunction with other sources of evidence like archaeology and non-biblical writings and history. Using such evidence, scholars think the earliest stories of Israel started taking shape between 1250 BC and the start of the first Israel biblical monarchy 3,000 years ago. These early bits of tradition included stories about God's involvement with Israel and its people. And groups coming to Israel, I thought, to have brought these ideas and bits of tradition with them and then shared them, perhaps as they gathered with other groups of common cult sites, maybe even around campfires. And as wider circles of group heard the traditions, bits of them, such as the Exodus story, resonated throughout the groups and were adopted by them. And the root event which gave rise to the Exodus tradition is thought to have occurred somewhere around 1250 BC. It appears that a small group setting from the history and the archaeological and biblical data, a small group settling in Palestine may have actually experienced being liberated out of slavery in Egypt and brought into Palestine. And although it's historically unlikely all early Hebrews experienced an actual exodus from Egypt, they could all still relate to and claim God saves type of experiences. Metaphorically, it worked. And so it's not that more and more adopted Exodus as Israel's common story to express collective, remembered experiences of salvation by a loving God. The scholars actually suggest that salvation may be the earliest core theme celebrated. Deuteronomy 26 suggests this as it refers to a harvest ritual that surprisingly does not celebrate the blessing of creation as expected, but celebrates the blessing of Exodus and salvation by Yahweh. Exodus is the seed, not just for harvest tradition, but how other traditions grow and God is experienced in the Bible. Exodus seed sprouts can be found throughout our scripture. Simply put, early Israel saw God through the lens of Exodus, experienced God Exodus-wise, and expected God to always act Exodus-wise. God brought Hebrews, lowly cultural nobodies, out of trouble, delivered and redeemed them. God loved these people. And as a consequence, Israel committed itself to God and sought to love God in return and all of God's people. The earliest version of the Exodus story we briefly looked at a couple of weeks ago with Miriam singing to Yahweh. That version is so old it may actually go back to near the time of the actual Exodus. It's a story where ancient Near East God Yahweh uniquely and quite remarkably fends for slaves, powerless people. And I've mentioned before that this was a radical departure from experiences of other gods who loved and protected only the powerful. As my Old Testament professor John Brocky put it, this reimagined the world. It reimagined God. God's no longer a warrior who sides only with the powerful, but a warrior who helps the powerless fight the oppression of the powerful. Yahweh defeats the powerful Pharaoh, and Yahweh does so by disrupting the order of the world for male and female slaves. God takes them out of their bondage and brings them through death and chaos in life to a safe place, and then later to the land of milk and honey. Exodus, this earliest of biblical themes of rescue and salvation, is of utmost importance to early Israel's understanding of God. It resonates, it sings to them, and it becomes the core of biblical theology. This reimagining of God in the Exodus story is a monumental moment in the evolution of human understanding of God in Jewish and Christian tradition. Prior to this, human leaders imagined God's only sided with the powerful. The Hebrews came along and imagined Yahweh, a warrior God who champions for the little guys, for and against the other gods. Eventually, Yahweh is reimagined as the one God, and monotheism occurs and is passed on through generations, even down to us today. And also passed down, of course, is the notion of being able to reimagine God as the Hebrews did in the Exodus story of salvation, through miracles and God's compassion and faithful human actions. The Jesus movement comes out of this tradition. Reimagining God's incarnate actions in the world is happening through a fully human being. First through Jesus the Christ, and then through us. Salvation by God through Christ within, acting outward in the world. And it's not just personal salvation for the purpose of bringing ourselves to heaven. Rather, it's salvation for all of creation, for the purpose of bringing heaven to all in the here and now. You can hear this save all reimagining in the words from Isaiah, also used to describe John the Baptist's proclamation as the one who is coming. Remember that story in Luke 3:3-6. John went into all the region around Jordan, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, as it is written in the book of the words of the prophet Isaiah, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness. Prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways made smooth, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God. And we can hear it too in the Gospel of John, when John the Baptist saw Jesus coming toward him and declared, "Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And perhaps it's best heard in Matthew 25. We're told that those who tend to the hungry, the thirsty, the sick, and the imprisoned, in other words, those who aid the oppressed, like God in the Exodus, those actions gain God's realm. They serve as salvation for action as well, for those who act as well as for those who are in need. See, like Miriam, Moses, and early Judaism, Jesus and the early church reimagined God and made all the difference. And Exodus is a seminal recorded experience of God in the Old Testament. In it, we learn that God sides with justice regardless of power, and visions of God's by the powerful. The Exodus-wise God yearns to save the whole world. An Exodus story from enslavement of the Hebrews to the 10 plagues to today's lesson is one of the oldest in our tradition. In it, we are called to imagine God as Savior to all. Jesus and the Gospel writers and Paul carried on this tradition. And may we continue to carry it on. Imagine God as everyone's Exodus-wise God, the one who through us works to save us, to save others, to save the whole wide world.